Okay, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm using these new headphones. Just trying to make sure actually that they're actually what's delivering and receiving the sound. Okay, good. I don't know. Oh, it still doesn't seem to be coming out of the. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, hopefully it's coming through the headphones and the microphone. It seems to be. Um, so I figured maybe this would be a bit easier since I'm at home. And there's always stuff going on. This way I can concentrate a little bit better on, well, on delivering the lecture rather than on various noises that are occurring around me. So the plan for today is to finish off our discussion of dualism. And we left off right around here. We had just finished talking about um, Princess Elizabeth's objections to Descartes' dualism. Now, before we proceed, we don't have much to go to finish off the chapter, but before we proceed, I was wondering if there's any questions from last time that I can help clear up. Okay. Okay, very good. So then, what we'll have to do is go on to talk about the pairing problem. The pairing problem concerns how we establish these so-called pairing relations. And the pairing relations that concern us here are the relations or potential pairing relations between the mind and the body. This matters because how these things are paired up, or how to best understand how they are causally paired together, depends not just on how we establish these relations, but also, as we'll see, on just what kinds of things minds and bodies are. Right now, Descartes famously argued, as we saw last time, that the mind is a non-physical thinking thing, and the body is a non-thinking physical thing. Well, that's not exactly the same language that Descartes used, right? Descartes talks about material things or physical things as extended uh, substances, as bodies, right? But how could it be? This is related to the objection that Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia raised, right? How could a physical process, right? Light striking my retina, causing stuff to happen in my nervous system. How could that affect an immaterial mind? And how could an immaterial mind affect the physical, right? How does my intention to reach out and pick up this coffee and take a sip, how is it that um, actually, how does my intention actually cause me to do that, right? How can a non-extended um, thinking substance affect a physical extended non-thinking substance and vice versa. So how do we establish this pairing relation? There's a couple of ways we could do it. We could do it using the notion of a causal chain or the notion of with the notion of spatial relations. Let's talk about what each of these things are briefly. So what is a causal chain? Anyone want to take a stab at describing a causal chain to me? And it would be good if you could do it with an example. Think about cause and effect, physical cause and effect here. There is an example in the book. But yeah, Leo, that's good. Like a roll of dominoes falling over, right? Perhaps, I don't know, maybe my hand causes the first domino to fall, which causes the next to fall, which causes the next to fall. So A causes B, causes C, causes D, etc. Right? Stirring the coffee to mix it up. Exactly, Lee. Um, One big one you see in philosophy, which emerges a little while after this in the work of David Hume, is what I like to call billiard ball causation, right? So you can imagine a billiards table or a pool table, something like that. One of these tabletop games where we hit balls with sticks, right? So think of you're playing pool with your friends. Um, the the player moves the cue stick in such a way that it strikes the cue ball, which strikes the eight ball, which rolls into the corner pocket, right? A causes B causes C. That's a note. That's a causal chain. Um, I guess one thing that's worth mentioning is that this all happens because there are these law-like relations between causes and effects, right? This is what scientists call laws of nature, right? When scientists identify or articulate some law of nature, what they're doing is identifying these sort of law-like causal relations between things that exist out there in the physical world, right? Of course, if we bring it back to Hume, Hume says, this cause and effect business is a little bit sus. Um, uh, there's nothing necessary about effects following their causes or causes preceding their effects. It's just sort of this constant conjunction we always observe. But we don't need to worry about that for now. That's the notion of a causal chain, right? A causes B, causes C, causes D, etc. Or we could do it with the notion of spatial relations, which is we'll spend less time kind of fleshing this out immediately because this is the option that Kim picks. Do you think, though, that the notion of a causal chain could work for describing pairing relations with, say between mental and physical events? And why or why not? Well, maybe we'll kind of see as we go, right? Well, I'm just asking here, does the notion of using causal chains work to establish pairing relations between the mental and the physical? Well, I don't know, Leo, that might be a reason why it would work if the mental is physical. It seems to me to fall apart when you talk about immaterial minds causing physical events and physical events causing mental events. Um, Maybe this will become a little clearer as we explore the notion of spatial relations. So, Kim thinks we should opt to use spatial relations. So, Kim formulates this principle M. It is metaphysically possible for there to be two distinct physical objects, A and B, with the same intrinsic properties and hence the same causal potential or powers. One of these, say, A, causes a third object, C, to change in a certain way, but object B has no causal influence on it. So here we have this sort of problem, right? We have A and B with the same causal powers, and one of them affects C. Now, how do we determine which has the causal influence on what? Right? Let's try and make this a little more concrete. Can we make it a bit more concrete by um, positing, some concrete examples, perhaps? We have two objects, A and B. They have the same intrinsic properties and the same causal powers. Now, one of them, A in this case, causes a third object to change, but B has no causal influence on it. Let's make this more concrete. How can we make it more concrete? Okay. Um, so Kim does this with guns, right? Yeah, Holly, you're right. I kind of don't want. I mean, I don't know. I don't feel like using guns. It does make sense. Yeah, like gun A causes a change in object C, and gun B doesn't, even though they have the same causal powers, right? So imagine there's two like exact same, I don't know, like Colt 45 revolvers or something, right? So that's A and B. And C is a little tin can downrange. Now, each of these, since they have the same causal power, sorry, that's my dog, could affect C in the same way. But one of them did and one of them didn't, right? A was the gun that fired and hit that can. B was fired and maybe it missed the can or it hit something else, right? So how do we establish this pairing relation between A and C? Well, it's got to be grounded in something, something other than their intrinsic properties, because they're both identical weapons, right? They're both the same, which means they both have the same intrinsic properties and the same causal powers. So it must be their relational properties, the relational properties that A and B have with C that differentiates, or that not differentiates, but establishes this causal pairing relation. This is how Kim puts it. The fact that A but not B causes C to change must be grounded in some fact about A, B, and C. And since A and B have the same intrinsic properties, it must be their relational properties with respect to C that provide the desired explanation of their different causal roles. And that relation is probably a spatial one. That's the best candidate here, right? It's plausible to think that spatial relations do this job for us. Tula, shush, go lie down, stop barking. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my dog now that I'm using this headset. Um, if you can, I apologize. Okay, so now we formulate this new postulate, M star. Oh, good. I guess my microphone is working then. All right, perfect. That's good. As long as it's not distracting. Okay, so here's our new formulation, M star. It is metaphysically possible for there to be two souls, A and B, with the same intrinsic properties such that they both act in a certain way at the same time, and as a result, a material object C undergoes a change. Moreover, it is the action of A, not that of B, that is the cause of the physical change in C. So try and bring this back to the example we just looked at with the pistols, right? Um, it's A that causes a change in C owing to their spatial relations. So A, the gun that I'm slinging, is pointed at C. So when it fires, a bullet leaves the weapon and strikes this tin can, causing a change in that tin can. Now there's a hole in the tin can, right? Now B either did not fire at that can or did not fire at all, and it's that spatial relationship between A and C that allows us to pair, right? To pair these two things together. It's A that causes the changes in C. Now, instead of guns, we're talking about souls. Now, souls, and here's the key takeaway here, or the key thing to remember, I suppose, is that Cartesian souls are kind of like the guns in that they are intrinsically identical, right? My soul is an unextended thinking substance. And so is yours, according to Descartes. So they're like the guns in that they both have the same intrinsic properties. But the claim that Descartes is making is that these souls can cause physical changes in our bodies, and also that our changes in our bodies can affect the soul. So just imagine It's metaphysically possible, going back to Kim, for there to be two souls, A and B, with the same intrinsic properties, such that they both act in a certain way at the same time, and as a result, cause a material object C to undergo a change. Moreover, it is the action of A and not that of B that is the cause of the physical change in C. Now, how do we explain this? Maybe an interactionist substance dualist like Rene Descartes himself would want to reject this. But how and why? You got to explain why. Why would an interactionist dualist reject this anyway? I mean, maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd reject it though, because we're using spatial relations to pair um, the cause and the effect. Can there be spatial relations if the soul is not an extended substance? Yeah. Well, that's our problem too, right, Liam? That's the skeptic's problem. The non-interactionist substance dualist problem, right? More important, I think, for our purposes is if somebody like Descartes accepts this. So if you're talking to an interactionist substance dualist like Descartes, who believes that there are non-physical minds and physical bodies and that they can causally affect one another, what you really want to explain is how an immaterial cause can have material effects, or how a material cause can have immaterial effects. That's what's more important. But yeah, well, would they think that, Holly? If they do think that, then they're confused. Because the soul, at least if you're a substance dualist, the soul is not a physical substance. It doesn't take up space. I think Kim says at some point in this chapter that the soul would be like a geometric point, right? Something that takes up no space at all. But how does that work, right? How could it affect the physical or be affected by the physical? Liam?
Well, I had a different thing, but a geometric point is something in space. Like it doesn't have any substance, but it is something that is spatially related to other things. So if he references it as a point, does it have spatial dynamics?
Maybe Kim is using the word a little bit differently than, or using this idea a little bit differently than a mathematician would.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that might be what's going on here. Um, but go ahead.
The other thing was like, are they thinking because like the mind and the body are linked, and all minds are the same, but obviously we all have different minds and different perspectives. Is it like the pairing that makes it individual? Is that the perspective that Descartes takes? It's not that the minds are individual or that the bodies are special. It's just that whenever you start pairing them, then they become individual.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and it's from. I am not an expert on Descartes, um, but it seems I have the impression that there's somewhat of a debate about this, right? Like what it is that individuates souls for Descartes. It's somewhat of a problem. Something that at least is not immediately clear when you read him. Like, if a soul is just a thinking substance, then yeah, what is it that individuates my soul from your soul? It can't be the intrinsic properties, as we've already seen. But beyond that, I don't think Descartes actually says much about this. This is more of a problem that I think John Locke takes up, for example, or even Spinoza and Leibniz to a certain extent. So what is it that individuates souls? It's I can only say with certainty it's not immediately clear for Descartes what individuates souls. At least not to me. Maybe somebody else who knows more about Descartes could give you a better answer. So I'm sorry if it's not a totally satisfactory answer, but yeah, that's all I'm really confident in saying, given my expertise. Like Liam said, like if a geometric point is it's a point in space. It's not made of anything. It's just like a point in space. Uh, that leads us to this question: what if we were to place the immaterial soul in space, like in physical space, where we are, not like outer space or anything like that necessarily? Well, then we're faced with the problem of where the mind is and how it interacts with the body. Yeah, like Holly says here, what is the mechanism of action and integration? That's where I'm stuck. A kind of converter would need to exist. I get that he tried with the pineal gland, but it would need to be able to exist as both substances to integrate, which is a contradiction. Yeah, this is kind of the problem that Princess Elizabeth had, right? Like she said, I would rather accept that minds are physical, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but Princess Elizabeth basically articulated that she would rather accept that minds are physical instead of accepting that a non-physical substance can affect a physical substance and vice versa. This is really the downfall of the mind-body of mind-body dualism. It's the mind-body interaction problem. Um, there's really no good answer to this problem, but it's a problem that exists because of substance dualism. It's a problem that you only really have if you're a substance dualist. Um, at least this form of the problem, right? When it comes to pairing um, non-physical causes with physical effects and with physical causes with non-physical effects. It's like we've created our own problem here with substance dualism that we now have to deal with. And yeah, like Holly just said, Descartes thought that this interaction occurred in the pineal gland, but could we locate the the mind or the locus of mind body interaction, right? Is the mind or the soul a part of my brain or in some part of my brain? Or is it in some part of my body? Previously, in some of our lectures, we've talked about how we're used to thinking of the mind being in the head or in the brain, and even of thinking of things being in the mind, like thoughts, perceptions, etc. Where are those? Well, they're in the mind, you might say. But somebody like Gilbert Ryle, right, would say, no, we're making a category mistake. The mind isn't like that, right? Uh, anyway, Kim says wherever the mind is, it would have to be a geometric point because minds are not extended. But even then, that doesn't really answer uh, that doesn't really answer the objections of Princess Elizabeth. And that's why I think Descartes takes it as a given that minds, bodies, the non-extended thinking substance and the extended non-thinking substance, yeah, they interact. That's just how it works, right? But he doesn't explain it. And this is kind of like what I said earlier, right? Right here on slide 25. This sort of interactionist substance dualism raises more problems than it solves. So, what is the mind? And how is it related to the body? Well, to summarize Descartes, I am my mind, you are your mind, etc. The mind or the soul is a non extended thinking substance. That is its essential nature. And bodies are not like that. Bodies are extended. They have what Kim calls bulk, or what I will call mass. They take up space. Um, How do they interact, you might say, if you're, somebody like Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia? They just do. Well, that's not a very satisfactory answer. Um, Descartes actually, elsewhere in the Meditations and elsewhere in his larger body of work, invokes God to solve this problem, um, which is really kind of an example of the God of the gaps argument, which you might be familiar with. Like, uh, what is the God of the gaps argument? Anybody familiar with this one? It's actually not something you hear talked about in philosophy classes that much. It's really more something that's associated with like Reddit atheism and stuff like that. Holly is not. Yeah, Josh, that's kind of close. Who had their hand up? Someone else had their hand up. Oh, Hayden. Go ahead, Hayden.
Excuse me. I was just going to ask if that is basically the idea that uh, God is just sort of used to explain what a given population hasn't understood in another way
Yeah.
yet.
Yeah, pretty much like you said, and like Joshua says here, we have a gap in our knowledge. We don't know how something works. So it's not that the gap is explained, the gap itself, it's that whatever we don't know, we attribute that to God. Now, Descartes' God is a deistic God mostly. It's the a deism. What? Well, first of all, what is deism as opposed to theism? Do we know? Anybody want to tell me? Well, a theistic God is a God that actively intervenes, right, in the universe. So a theistic God listens to your prayers and answers your prayers, perhaps. Theistic God performs maybe miracles or something, right? A theistic God is actively involved. Um, I think when people talk about like the God of the Old and New Testament, for example, that's a theistic God for sure. A deistic God, on the other hand, is more like a watchmaker. So a deistic God doesn't actively intervene in the universe, at least not very, if he does, not very often. Although it gets a little tricky here. Because Descartes is also a Catholic, right? And if you're a Catholic, you've also got to believe in stuff like miracles and the resurrection and so on, right? So God must intervene somehow. But by and large, a deistic God creates the universe, sets up all the rules, right? All the laws of physics and laws of nature and so forth, sets it running, and then doesn't do anything. Just leaves it running, like a watchmaker makes a watch, winds it up and lets it go, and then doesn't actively interfere in its workings, right? That's predominantly the God that philosophers like Descartes have in mind when that's who they're invoking. Um, so maybe God, and by the way, God is also a substance. God for Descartes is a perfect substance. So there's extended substance, bodies, thinking substance, minds or souls, and perfect substance or infinite substance, which is God itself. Um, and so we can invoke such a God to answer the question how minds and bodies interact. That maybe that's just the way God made us, right? Um, but that doesn't satisfactorily solve this problem for a lot of people. So that's why there are not very many substance dualists today. I mean, there are a lot of substance dualists out and about. There are a lot of people who, if you asked, they would answer, yes, I believe that what we really are souls, and we have these bodies, but these bodies are temporary, and the soul is like, it's like kind of like getting back to the Platonic notion of a soul. Souls are divine, non-corporeal, incorruptible. Souls are very special. Souls are that sort of spark of the divine in all of us, and we are not really identical with our bodies, but with our souls. A lot of people would countenance such a view, right? But not a lot of philosophers would. Why? Well, because it raises problems. It raises problems that we can't seem to solve, right? So this is what Kim says here when it comes to substance dualism. He says, if you have set aside substance dualism, at least for now, you can take having a mind simply as having a certain special set of properties, capacities, and characteristics. Something that humans and some higher animals possess, but sticks and stones do not. To say that something has a mind is to classify it as a certain sort of thing, as a thing with capacities for certain characteristic sorts of behavior and functions, such as sensation, perception, memory, learning, consciousness, and goal-directed action. For this reason, it is less misleading to speak of having a mind, of having mentality, than having a mind. And that is property dualism of a sort. Um, substance dualism for a long time, well, maybe not for a long time, maybe felt like the only game in town. Although there were substance monists who tried to solve the mind-body interaction problem introduced by Descartes. Some of these thinkers are mentioned in this chapter. You've got Spinoza, right? Baruch Spinoza was a substance monist who believed that there's really only one substance, and that's God. Um, and God, being this sort of infinitely perfect substance, can have lots of different attributes, like thought and extension. And each of us is a mode, a finite mode of God that has the attributes of thought and extension. So there's no interaction problem because we're all just little parts of this perfect substance, which is the only thing that exists. So um, extension and thought are not two different substances, they're two aspects of the same substance. That is God. So Spinoza is kind of like a pantheist or a panentheist, and that actually got him into a lot of trouble. Um, or Leibniz, right? Everything is monads and pre-established harmony. So it only looks as though there's interaction, but it's actually a pre-established harmony. Again, due to God, right? Nowadays, though, most philosophers don't subscribe to these beliefs. There are some, but most philosophers of mind, especially in the analytic tradition, are going to subscribe to some kind of physicalism, maybe reductive physicalism or type physicalism. So remember, this is like, well, type physicalism is reductive. So there are types of physical states and physical events, and these just are what mental states and mental events are. We'll look at this later when we talk about identity theory. Or you could be a property dualist. So there are two different kinds of properties. There are mental properties and there are physical properties. The mental properties are distinct from and irreducible to the physical properties. But without the physical properties, you don't have the mental properties. So we're talking supervenience here, right? As Kim writes, dualism is no longer a dualism of two sorts of substances. It is now a dualism of two sorts of properties, mental and physical. Property is used here in a broad sense. Mental properties comprise mental functions, capacities, events, states, and the like. And similarly for physical properties. Now, if you're a reductive physicalist, you once again, you would say that mental properties are reducible to the physical properties. But property dualism denies that. Property dualism says that sure, you need the mental properties to have the or the physical properties to have the mental properties, but the mental properties are not reducible to the physical. What these both have in common is that they agree that minds are not immaterial substance. Okay, that's it for Descartes and dualism. Wow, that only took nearly 40 minutes. So we are a little bit behind. We've got to start the behaviorism stuff now. But does anyone have any questions about what we've covered? All right. So what we will do is look at the mind and its relation to behavior. A quick note, Kim uses the American spelling. I've kind of changed it to the Canadian spelling. So there's a U in there. So even when I quote Kim, I just kind of did a lazy find and replace, and uh, I've changed all of the instances of the American spelling to the Canadian spelling, even the ones in Kim's book, just because I didn't want to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. But that's why, if you notice a difference in terms of the spelling of this word from the book, even if it's in a quotation here, that's why. So let's talk about mind and behavior. Here's what William James had to say about psychology. Now, James was an important figure in establishing psychology as a scientific discipline. And he described psychology as the science of mental life, both of its phenomena and of their conditions. The phenomena are such things as we call feelings, desires, cognitions, reasonings, decisions, and the like. And that sounds, like a pretty good definition, right? How would you describe psychology? Maybe some of you are psychology majors, actually. I know some of you are, in fact, studying psychology as your major. How would you define psychology? Would you agree with James? Or would you add something? Or would you describe it completely differently than William James has done? I'm curious to hear from both psychology majors and non-psychology majors. So feel free to raise your hand or leave your thoughts in the chat. Oh, interesting. A combination of James and Watson. Yeah, doesn't include anything on behavior. Well, decisions, I would say decisions and the like, and desires do bear some important relation with behavior. But yeah, you're right. He doesn't really articulate that here, although he does at other in other places. But we would say, I mean, just look at the etymology of the word psychology, right? I mean, psychology from psyche or psyche, which means the soul. And remember that soul, in this context, your soul is just your mind, right? But here's what Watson had to say, the initiator of behaviorism. Psychology is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. And yeah, is that all there is to it? I know some of you had already offered some thoughts. Like Holly says, it's a combination of James and Watson. We can't dismiss the mental, but we can't dismiss behavior. Not sure about control of behavior. Yeah. Um, so you can look this up on your own time, but look up the little Albert experiment just to get an idea of what we have in mind here. I can't remember if it was Watson or Skinner who said that essentially we could we could achieve this ideal utopian society um, if we just sort of educated everyone using um, conditioning, which is how the behaviorists thought we learned. And we do learn some things via conditioning. But the idea was, at least when it comes to like what Samantha's saying, control of behavior, the idea is that um, we could turn somebody, we could just take a baby, and with the right sort of conditioning, we could raise, a doctor, a scientist, a firefighter, whatever we want, just with the appropriate sort of education, which was all about um, conditioning. And yeah, behaviorism treats psychology as the science of behavior, and that's where we get terms like behavioral science from, right? And it was dominant, I would say, starting in the early 20th century up until the time of the cognitive revolution, which, you know, it's like the 1960s basically is when the cognitive sciences started to, well, they had the cognitive sciences had already been around for a while. It was in the 60s that a lot of people turned their attention back toward the mental itself, and a lot of people in these different disciplines, like not only psychology but computer science, linguistics, um, stuff like that, neuroscience to a certain extent, although that really got going in the 70s and 80s with the advent of functional neuroimaging. All of these people in all of these different groups, all of these different subject, areas of studies, realized that they were talking about the same thing, but coming at it from different angles, right? And this is around the time when cognitive psychology really became a thing and kind of replaced behaviorist psychology, right? There are philosophical forms of behaviorism, and we are going to look at those. But for now, behaviorism, think of it as the science of behavior. Psychology is the science of behavior. James had emphasized introspective techniques, which the behaviorists thought were unscientific. They wanted psychology to be like one of the natural sciences, right? Like physics. It had to be purely objective. So you couldn't rely on introspective techniques where subjects kind of introspect and report the contents of their own mind because it's not objective. It's too subjective, right? James liked the introspective approach, but he acknowledged the importance of behavior, right? James wrote, "The pursuance of future ends and the choice of means for their attainment are thus the mark and criterion of the presence of of mentality in a phenomenon." We all use this test to discriminate between an intelligent and a mechanical performance. We impute no mentality to sticks and stones because they never seem to move for the sake of anything, whereas people do, yeah, and non-human animals do. We behave. Sticks and stones don't behave, right? We act. That's another way of putting it is that we act. We are agents. Sticks and stones are not agents. They are acted upon or affected by things, but they don't act. They don't behave, right? That's something that things with minds do. The thing for the behaviorists is then to come along and say, well, if we want psychology to be an objective science like physics, behavior is really all we have to go on. So let's look at behavior. Behavior is a way of operationalizing the mental for the behaviorists. Um, yeah, and like Holly says, we can only test and observe what consciousness does via behavior. Even answering questionnaires is a kind of behavior. Yeah, absolutely. I think the mistake of the behaviorists was to completely forget about inner states. But they do try and operationalize the mental as behavior. Now, what is operationalism? Anyone want to tell me? When we operationalize something, what are we doing? Well, we're taking something that we cannot observe and observing something else that we think is closely associated or related to it in an important way. So we can't observe the mental. So what do? We observe behavior. And this is not the only time we're going to encounter this, right? The behaviorists like John Watson, B.F. Skinner, they looked at what Watson, I think, is perhaps more famously associated with classical conditioning, and Skinner with operant conditioning. So classical conditioning is when you're kind of relying on unconditioned responses that are already there. Like think of Pavlov's dogs, right? Everybody know the story about Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. So Ivan Pavlov was a Russian psychologist who he had dogs in his laboratory, and he had a bell on the door, and he'd go to feed the dogs in the lab, and the bell would ring, and the dogs would salivate because there's food, right? So that's a response to an unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to condition a dog to salivate when you presented it with food. The dog already does that because it's excited that it's going to get some yummy dog food, right? Um, but what Pavlov noticed is the dogs would begin salivating when the bell rang, even if there was no food. So the dogs associated the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus. That's the bell. So that every time the bell rang, they thought, oh, food, and got hungry and started salivating, right? That's classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is more like, a rat in a Skinner box where we're training it to do something it wouldn't normally do naturally. So we're training it to push a green button to get a treat instead of the red button, which will give it a shock. Something like that. That's operant conditioning, right? And that was how the behaviorists operationalized the mental. So, subjective verbal reports that are generated from introspecting into one's own mind. No, no, we don't want that. Only behavior, only observable behavior is what matters. We'll see this a little bit today, and also when we look at machine functionalism. One of the supplementary readings for machine functionalism is Alan Turing's paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, where he first introduces the notion of the Turing test. Turing operationalizes behavior or operationalizes the mental using verbal behavior specifically. Likewise does like Hempel, as we'll see. If you read the supplementary reading for today, you'll see that Hempel's doing something very similar to that. Rene Descartes did the same thing. Um, Rene Descartes thought that the mark of the mental was verbal behavior. That was how you could know something had reason, had a soul. Um, it could um, it could use reason as a universal instrument, but um, it could also speak to you, right? And potentially infinite, and it could say what it needs to say in potentially any infinite number of different ways. Um, that's something that like animals or automata cannot do, Descartes argued. So behaviors are the only observable data that matter. That's the claim of the behaviorist psychologists. But there are also philosophical behaviorists, like Hempel, who say that behavior is constitutive of the mental. So that's just what the mental is. Any questions so far before we dive into this Cartesian theater notion? All right, doesn't look like there are any questions. So let's talk about the Cartesian theater. This is one way we can conceive of the mind, is as a theater. It's probably not a good way to conceive of the mind, but let's just bracket that and think of the mind as a theater. What does it mean to think of the mind as a theater? Well, here's a sort of pixelated image of a theater. This is actually the Royal Albert Hall in London. And you can think of the mind as a theater, and all of our perceptions, our thoughts, our emotions, they take place on this stage right here. And you are like the audience. So try and connect this with your own experience of your own mind and of the world, right? So you're sitting here, you're watching me. Everything you see and hear is like what happens on the stage, on the mental stage, and you are the audience. What do you think of that metaphor? Is it intuitive? Does it make sense to you? Does it seem to raise some problems? What do we think? Makes sense. It makes sense. So yes, it makes sense to Holly. Yes. Or yes, it raises problems. Yeah, it's missing. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's fair. This notion of the Cartesian theater is not actually due to Descartes. It's due to Daniel Dennett, who describes this sort of Cartesian way of thinking about the mind as a place in which things happen, right? But you're right, Samantha. It's missing what you can control. That's why sometimes I also use the giant robot metaphor, right? So if there are any anime fans out there, you must be familiar with the mecha genre, where you have giant robots that fight. Sometimes they fight other giant robots. Sometimes they fight, I don't know, kaiju, angels, aliens, could be anything. Anyway, maybe you are like the pilot of the giant robot. So you see the world in your little cockpit, but you can also affect the world by piloting this giant robot, right? That solves the problem that Samantha points out. But again, like Holly says, it is a metaphor. Um, Another Samantha says, so Samantha B says, I like the metaphor in that I can change seats on my mental view to look at my thoughts. That's kind of an interesting way to think about it. Yeah. So yeah, like you just have to keep in mind that this is a metaphor. It's not really a way we should look at the mental, though. Daniel Dennett, this is a bit beyond the scope of this chapter, but Dennett associates this thinking about the mind in this way with something that he called Cartesian materialism, which is when we say we're materialists or physicalists, but we still let these implicitly Cartesian notions in through the back door. And in this case, it's the idea that there is a time and a place in the mind where things happen. Minds aren't like that, Dennett is trying to argue. If you want to know more, you can read his book, Consciousness Explained. Um, so it's very intuitive. There are problems with it, but let's not worry too much about those for now, except for when it comes to solipsism. Now, here's a problem with the Cartesian theater, irrespective of the Cartesian materialist stuff that Dennett is concerned about. One problem that should concern us is that if the mind really does work like this, right? If my mind is like my own private theater and everything in my mind is what's happening on the stage and I am the experiencer, then knowledge of other minds is impossible. And for others, knowledge of my mind is impossible. This is called solipsism. Solipsism comes from the Latin, I think it is solus ipse, which means the self alone. And indeed, this was a worry raised against Descartes. This is something that concerns this fellow pictured here, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Um, I don't know. What do we think? Can you see why on the Cartesian theater metaphor, solipsism is a worry? Lily says yes. Lee says it also doesn't seem like it accounts for the feeling that we have free will. Yeah, but again, just imagine that the theater is not a theater, but a giant robot, right? We're not worried. We're not worried about free will. Like you're right, but we're not worried about that right now. What we're worried about is more epistemological. So if my mind is like a theater, if your mind is like a theater, I can't ever sit in your theater. You can't sit in mine. So how can we have knowledge of each other's minds? Yes. Yeah, exactly, Lily. If we can't access other boxes, shared meaning becomes impossible. And that's where we're going to get to once we get to the beetle in the box, right? More examples that we could go over. I mean, what could you infer from behavior in cases like the following? Your roommate is listening to a weather report, and then she leaves the house with a raincoat and an umbrella. What can you infer? I think Hayden is going to type that, well, not necessarily that it's rain. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's that she believes it'll rain. But you could be wrong, right? You could be wrong about that. Maybe she's taking her friend to the water park, but she doesn't want to get wet. She doesn't want to go on any of the rides. And maybe you didn't hear it, but the weather report said it's actually not going to rain. Maybe she's mistaken about the weather. Or your roommate cries out in pain. You could surmise that she stubbed her toe. Then you might be correct, but there could be other reasons why she cries out in pain. Maybe she's watching a movie or a television show that she's getting really into and cries out, and you think it's a cry of pain, but it's actually a cry of anger at something one of the characters has done, right? You can also, in the first case, you can talk about beliefs and desires. The second case is a little bit different because we're dealing with a subjective sensation, right? Um, you can know, or you can make a reasonable guess at your roommate's beliefs and desires, right? Okay, she was listening to the weather report. Now she's leaving. She's taking her umbrella. Therefore, she must believe that it's going to rain. Okay, that's reasonable. But your roommate cries out in pain. Okay, they've hurt themselves. But you can't know their pain. You see what I mean? There's a privateness to your roommate's sensation of pain. Because you can't sit in their theater, right? This is how Wittgenstein makes the point. He does this in the philosophical investigations, which are quoted in our textbook. Suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. Can you see the connection between the pain example and the beetle in the box? And if you can see it, would you like to elaborate on it? Yeah. So, Hayden, that's a good point. That's called the inverted spectrum. And it is related to this. It is related to this. Okay. So let's talk about beetles, right? Our mind is like the box. All our minds are like the boxes. And we have contents in our mind. These are the beetles, right? Um, yeah, Holly, basically, yeah, you're right. That's how Wittgenstein kind of saves us from solipsism. It's language. And more specifically, it's the way language works, right? But yeah, so okay, we all have beetles. We all have boxes, we all have beetles. And I say, um, such and such about my beetle. And you say, "Oh, I know what you mean. Same with my beetle." But we could have completely different beetles, right? Maybe my beetle is a rhinoceros beetle. But in your box, you have a different beetle. You have, I don't know, like a scarab, Um, and someone else has a Volkswagen Beetle, and someone else has John Lennon or Paul McCartney, right? And we're all talking about different things using the same word. And because we don't know what's in each other's boxes, right? That is similar to the inverted spectrum in the sense that, yeah, like Hayden says, my colors could be inverted so that we have flipped spectrums. Um, and when we point to the same color, like your red is my green, and we point to and we say the light is red right now. I experience it as red, but you experience it as green. But we'd have no way of knowing that we each have these different inner experiences of the color, right? So that's the beetle in the box. And the basic idea is that our behavior is publicly observable. Our private inner life is not. That's why it's private, right? It's like the beetle in the box or the show in the Cartesian theater. That's why behaviorists focused so strongly on observable behavior. Behavior is also agentive, and I kind of hinted at this before. This is why we behave and sticks, stones, etc. do not behave, right? If I decide I'm going to put my hand up, like maybe I'm in a class and I have a question, I need to ask the professor a question. If I raise my arm because I decided to, or I willed to, or I intended to, that's behavior, right? That's agentive. I acted, I'm an agent, so I acted on the basis of some reason or reasons. That's why my hand went up. That's behavior. But if someone else raises my arm for me, that's not behavior, right? Uh, a mad scientist could put a chip in my brain so that she could raise my arm whenever she wanted to. But if that action doesn't originate within me, but rather from the mad scientist, that's not behavior. Behavior also doesn't necessarily have to be intentional, right? Just think of sitting there breathing, right? That's a sort of behavior. But you don't have to always be thinking, okay, remember to breathe, right? So behaviors can be, I think maybe a clearer way of putting this is that behaviors can be voluntary or involuntary. But sticks, stones, uh, rivers, plants, well, there's an argument. You could make an argument about plants, but they don't behave. They don't act. They're not agents. I guess another example is like, when you go to the doctor and they hit your knee with a patellar hammer and your leg moves, that's not behavior. But if I say, "Would you move your leg for me?" and you do, that is behavior, right? So pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward. Here are some different kinds of behaviors. We have our physiological reactions and responses. So this could be your perspiration, your respiration, maybe salivation, something like coughing, an increase or decrease in your heart rate, an increase or decrease in blood pressure. These are all sorts of behaviors. These are things that living things do, right? And notice this one is not intentional. These would be involuntary behaviors. Then there are bodily movements, so walking, running, raising your hand, reaching out to opening a door, throwing a ball. And these are not limited. Both of these are not limited to humans. Obviously, animals have physiological reactions and responses. They also have bodily movements. So my cat, for example, is always trying to get me to let him outside, even though I don't want to. He's always trying to trick me and make me feel bad. But that doesn't work on me. So he'll scratch at the door, seeming to want to go outside. Or if you're a behaviorist psychologist, you're of course familiar with rats running around in T mazes, right? So that's bodily movements. Um, yeah, you could say that it's not like a reflex is not agentive. It's not intentional. Like it's not an action, I guess is what I really should say. It's not an action. All actions are behaviors, but not all behaviors are actions. Yeah, like the patellar hammer. Then we have actions involving bodily motions, greeting a friend, like, hey, you over there, writing out an email, going shopping, writing a check, going to a concert, right? All the stuff we do that involve complicated sort of chains of bodily actions, right? And then there are actions not involving overt bodily motions. These are sort of more mentalistic actions, like making a judgment, reasoning something out, making a guess at something, calculating a sum, making a decision, intending to do something, right? We can do all of this without actually physically moving. So these are actions too. Oh, dogs are at it again. I hope you can't hear them. So which of these meet the criterion of the behaviorists for being publicly observable? Only one and two, what we could call motions and noises. Why? Well, let's go back. We can observe physiological reactions and responses. Think about it. We can use all kinds of devices to do that. A doctor can use a stethoscope to listen to your respiration and your heart rate. Um, we could use a galvanometer to measure your perspiration, right? Um, we could take your pulse even just by doing this, right? So those are publicly observable. And bodily movements are publicly observable. 3 and 4, not so much. Why? Well, think about 3. Greeting a friend, writing an email. Say I'm greeting a friend. I'm raising a hand. Hey, you don't have access to the inner states that are causing me to do that. You can't know for certain, why I'm raising my hand until you watch all the behaviors play out. I could be raising my hand to swat away a fly. Unless then you see someone else, hey, how's it going? And then we shake hands or something, right? And certainly these actions not involving overt bodily motions don't meet the behaviorist criterion. Because you can't observe people reasoning, judging, guessing, calculating, etc., without these bodily motions. The motions and the noises. So behavior in the sense of 1 and 2, as Kim says, does not enjoy the kind of privileged access granted to the first person in the Cartesian theater. That is, equal access for all is the essence of behavior as conceived by the behaviorist. That's why only the motions and noises, the one and 2, the examples 1 and 2, meet this criterion. Okay, we're really clicking along nicely here. I wonder if we should briefly stop for some questions and then maybe take a break. Take a 15-minute break. What do you think? Do you understand what I'm saying so far? Because I am moving a little bit faster than I normally do, just in the interest of getting caught up. Are we clear so far? What we mean, firstly, by behavior and why it's only certain sorts of behavior, namely the motions and noises, that meet the criterion of public availability and observability for the behaviorist. Lily's got it. That's great. I know I say this a lot, but don't be afraid to stop me if you're not sure about something. No, they're behaviors, but they're not the right kinds of behaviors. Or they're actions. You could say they're action behavior. They're not the right kind of behavior because greeting a friend, writing an email, judging, reasoning, etc. There's a sort of privileged access that the agent has that the behaviorist psychologist does not have. The behaviorist psychologist needs for the behaviors to be completely publicly observable. Yeah, exactly, Joshua. Great. Holly, go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna give this my best go. I work at a bar and I closed last night, so I'm not at my finest at all.
No
Uh,
problem.
I'm nervous to even speak, but it reminds me of I am a psych major, and in first year psych, so it's a little bit foggy for me because it's a long time ago. But um, comatose patients were found through fMRI to have thought. They could hear and they could communicate with scientists. The scientists could see what pathways were lit up and confirm that the patient could hear them and understand them with yes or no answers. And then they had them like, I want you to imagine playing tennis. And
Yes.
yeah, they were able to establish that the person could imagine playing tennis and they could confirm that with yes or no and repetition. But that said, even though they could literally watch the mental states, they could watch it electrically and chemically, you still can't see how that patient sees.
Yeah,
It's
exactly. There's still the problem of this privileged access.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think that's probably our best confirmation that even though we can literally see the processes in the brain, you don't know what that person's seeing. You have to.
exactly. Exactly, because what we're seeing on an fMRI are the neural correlates of the mental events, not the mental events themselves, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it
So,
is an private.
yeah. That's very good that you raised that. I hope we'll probably come back to this when we talk about consciousness, but you're right. There's a parallel there between behavior for the behaviorist psychologists and functional neuroimaging for the neuroscientists, right? So good work pointing that out. Let's take a break. Let's come back I'm at 3:46. So let's come back at 1 minute after 4. Does that sound good for everybody? Everybody can have a nice 15-minute brain break. I know that I need one because it's Monday and I'm out of coffee. I need to make more. All right. We'll come back and we will pick up on this slide where we start talking about Carl Hempel. Okay. See you all in 15 minutes. All right, let's get started again. I'm recording. I'll share my screen once again. Okay, whoopsie daisy. So now we're looking. We've talked a little bit about behaviorism in psychology. We'll circle back to that toward the end, if we get that far today. I hope we do. But now we're going to talk about philosophical behaviorism. So, um, Carl Hempel, who was a logical positivist, wrote the following, which is quoted in your textbook. You can also read this in the supplementary reading that I've made available. We see clearly, Hempel said, that the meaning of a psychological statement consists solely in the function of abbreviating the description of certain modes of physical response characteristics of the bodies of men and animals. Okay, what's that mean? Well, first, a bit of background. Who is familiar with logical positivism as a movement in philosophy? Holly's not familiar. That's okay. That's why I'm here. Anyone else? Of the philosophy majors, who's familiar? It seems like the majority of people who are responding in the chat are unfamiliar with it. So the logical positivists, this is kind of a movement in philosophy that's associated with a group of thinkers known as the Vienna Circle. um, Kind of like early mid 20th century analytic stuff that happened on the continent, though. Um, but the idea is, if you're a member of the Vienna Circle, you emphasize the verification principle of meaning. Now, the idea here is that for us to know whether something is true, it has to be verifiable. And when it comes to the meaning of, say, sentences we utter, right? there has to be what we call intersubjective verifiability. Science is not has kind of gotten away from verificationism. We don't really verify. Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, um, who would have been in communication and discussion with a lot of the members of the Vienna Circle, actually would later go on to argue that what scientists are actually doing is falsifying, not verifying. So if you have a hypothesis, a scientific hypothesis, you don't what you actually do when you test it is not attempt to verify it. What you're actually doing is attempting to falsify it. And it's that failure to falsify that is your basis for concluding that that scientific statement says something true. Um, this gets a little bit tricky, right? Because you need a lot of attempts. You need replication, right? Lots of failures to falsify some claim or some statement wherein we find a claim about the world doesn't prove that what that claim is saying is true, but it makes it increasingly likely that that claim is actually correctly describing what's happening. And that's how science works. But this was kind of pre-falsification, where we were all about verification, right? And in order to verify, things have to be intersubjectively verifiable. They have to be publicly observable, right? And this is known as logical behaviorism. So, what logical behaviorism does is emphasize the logical connections between expressions that are about psychology or psychological states, mental states, and expressions that are about behavior. Sometimes we also call logical behaviorism analytical behaviorism, in addition to philosophical behaviorism. Now, this probably all sounds a bit tricky, so let's try and formalize it a little bit. Kim formalizes this first statement, logical behaviorism 1, which states that any meaningful psychological statement, that is, a statement purportedly describing a mental phenomenon, can be translated without loss of content, that is, without loss of meaning, into a cluster of statements solely about behavioral and physical phenomena. We can broaden this out too, as Kim does in logical behaviorism 2. Every meaningful psychological expression can be defined solely in terms of behavioral and physical expressions. That is, expressions referring to behavioral and physical phenomena. And 2 entails 1 as well. That's something else Kim points out. So before we go any further, do you understand what I've said about these two formulations here of logical behaviorism? What does it mean? Like, can we try and come up with an example to clarify this a little bit? What does it mean to say that statements that describe mental phenomena can be translated into statements about behavioral and physical phenomena without any loss of content? Well, first let's come up with a sentence that describes some mental phenomenon. Can we come up with one? It can be very simple. It could be a very simple example. Okay. Ollie's confused. And Hayden says, I don't understand logical behaviorism. Lee says that too. Well, Hayden, that's actually a good example. Yeah, let's do that. Let's say our statement describing uh, our mental state is Hayden doesn't understand logical behaviorism, right? Okay. So that's our sentence that describes Hayden's mental state. Hayden doesn't understand logical behaviorism. The claim is that we can translate that into a statement purely about behavior or about physical phenomena without the meaning of that first statement changing. So instead of talking about mentalistic stuff, we could say Hayden utters the sentence, I don't understand logical behaviorism. And also, if we were to look at Hayden's brain, maybe we would see certain physical events in that brain, which are correlated with the mental state of a lack of understanding or with confusion or something, right? Maybe Hayden also does other things. Like maybe Hayden utters the sentence, I don't understand logical behaviorism, as he scratches his head and is reading a book about logical behaviorism, scratches his head and goes, I don't understand logical behaviorism. We don't need the mental state. We can translate the statement, Hayden doesn't understand logical behaviorism, into a series of physical and behavioral statements without losing the meaning, without losing the content. That's what this means. It means basically that we can take any statement that describes, anything about the mental and translate it so that it's no longer about the mental, but about the behavioral and the physical without changing the meaning. Are we clear now? Okay, so Lee asks, does this mean that even thoughts that aren't said or expressed still can be explained with physical and behavioral statements? Yes. I mean, yeah, that I think so. It means that, like, we don't even have to have a mentalistic state to translate into a behavioral or a physicalist description. Um, we could just formulate anything that we would formulate in mentalistic terminology in behavioral and physical terminology, like in principle. We're just saying translate because probably most of us are used to talking about mentalistic terms, right? Hayden says, "What if I'm not actually doing anything about my lack of understanding, though?" Um, well, let's say you didn't utter the sentence, "I don't understand logical behaviorism." You didn't scratch your head in confusion. I might still be able to identify some physical state, like your brain state. If I had enough knowledge of the brain, conceivably, right? If I had enough knowledge of the brain and I had an appropriate means of scanning your brain, kind of like what Holly said about the comatose patient and the tennis playing, I could still like capture some physical description, right? Yeah, and like Lee said, okay, yeah. So Lee, you were wondering the same thing, eh? Yeah, so basically like it's in principle anything that you could say using mentalistic language, you could say instead in behavioral or physical terms, and those are what are publicly accessible. So we need to not talk about mentalistic stuff. We got to talk about behavioral and physical stuff because that's what's publicly accessible. That's what is intersubjectively verifiable. Yeah. So this is kind of like Hempel's thought process, right? Um, and here we can explain this verification principle of meaning, which is very important in terms of the epistemology of logical positivism. So the meaning of a sentence is given by the conditions that must be verified to obtain if the sentence is true. We'll call these verification conditions. So this is how we know the meaning of a sentence. It's given by the conditions that we have to check if those conditions obtain if the sentence is true. What does it mean to obtain, right? Well, right now, it's sunny outside. So I could utter a sentence. It is sunny outside. How do I know that that's true? Well, there are certain conditions that must be checked to see if they obtain. to see if the sentence is true. So if somebody says, imagine you're inside a dark building, no windows, and you haven't been outside for a while. Somebody comes in and says, it's quite sunny outside. Okay, we know what that means. It means it's sunny just in case it's actually sunny. What the sentence is saying something about the world. And the verification conditions are the conditions that have to obtain, that we can actually go and observe for ourselves. So I might say, is it really sunny outside? Well, I'll go outside and see for myself. I do. I see that it's sunny. So I know, because I've observed that the verification conditions have obtained, that that sentence is true. I know this is a very wordy, complicated way of saying this, right? But that's, in a nutshell, what the verification principle of meaning is all about. Now, the second point. If a sentence has meaning that can be shared by different speakers, then its verification conditions have to be accessible to each speaker. So, like I said earlier, it's got to be publicly observable, right? So maybe now there are a bunch of people in this building that haven't been outside for a little bit, and somebody comes in and says it's sunny outside. The verification conditions are that it is in fact sunny outside. It is in fact the case that the sun is not obscured by clouds, or that it's not nighttime, right? But these verification conditions are accessible to each speaker. All of us could go outside and check if we wanted to, and we could see whether it is indeed sunny. And three, only, this is the important part when it comes to behaviorism, only behavioral and physical phenomena, including those physiological occurrences we talked about earlier. These could be changes in the brain. These could be changes in the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, changes in skin conductance, whatever, right? These are the only things that are publicly observable. Therefore, the final point, the shareable meaning of any psychological sentence must be specifiable by statements of publicly observable verification conditions. Excuse me, my throat's a little bit dry right now. That is, statements describing behavioral and physical conditions that must hold if the psychological statement is true. I know this is wordy, I know this is highly technical, but you get the idea? Very good. And so, Kim continues on. If anyone insists that there are inner subjective criteria for psychological expressions as well, we should reply, the behaviorists would argue, that even if such existed, they, like Wittgenstein's beetles, could not be part of the meanings that can be understood and shared by different persons. Summarizing all this, we could say, insofar as psychological expressions have interpersonal meanings, they must be divinable in terms of behavioral and physical expressions. All this is a very wordy way of saying that the data, oh, excuse me, the data that behaviorist psychologists want has to be objective data, not subjective data. It has to be intersubjectively verifiable. There might exist inner states, subjective states, sure, but they're not intersubjectively verifiable. They're not objective. Mental states are subjective. Our mental states are like the beetles in the box. So they're not intersubjectively verifiable. Again, we might all be talking about our beetles, and it would be possible, says Wittgenstein, for everyone to have something quite different in their box. Now, let's test this, right? Let's test this against an example, which is actually drawn from Hempel. So Paul, this poor Paul, whoever he is some poor guy who has a toothache. My throat is... See, look, here I'm reporting something. My throat is dry. I think it's got to do with the wildfire smoke. My throat is dry. Now, I may have an inner subjective sort of experience of that, but that's not what matters for the behaviorist. For the behaviorist, what matters is publicly available, objective, intersubjectively verifiable stuff that we can put in sentences. So, um, sure, my throat is dry, but what the behaviorist is going to be looking out for is, a raspy voice or coughing, or maybe a physician could look down there with his tools, give me a little bit of an endoscope and see that there's some irritation, right? That's what matters. Likewise, with this example from Hempel's reading, Paul has a toothache. How do we translate this into behavioral and physical statements without losing meaning? Well, one statement might be Paul weeps and makes gestures of such and such kinds, like, ah, my tooth, right? If Paul had a bad toothache, he might do that. We could ask Paul, what is the matter? And Paul might say, I have a toothache. Okay, yeah, that's pretty straightforward. Closer examination might reveal decayed tooth with exposed pulp. So Paul goes to the dentist and says, yep, you've got a decayed tooth and the pulp was exposed. We could even conceivably take some other measurements, which we could describe in a sentence like D, Paul's blood pressure, digestive processes, the speed of his reactions show such and such changes that are consistent with him having a pain in his tooth. And then there are other processes and changes that occur in Paul's central nervous system, which conceivably we could measure objectively, right? So that's how Hempel translates Paul has a toothache into these various sentences that are not about Paul's subjective experience of pain, but rather about behavioral and physical events. And the claim is, just to make sure we're keeping this in mind, the claim is that we've translated this into, we've translated Paul has a toothache into A through E without a loss of meaning. That's the idea. But have we really? Which two sentences are really translatable? Maybe only A and B. Paul weeps and makes gestures of such and such kinds. At the question, what is the matter? Paul utters the words, I have a toothache. So we have pain behavior and verbal behavior. But even B might not be translatable in the way that a behaviorist wants because it concerns verbal behavior. What's the problem there? Yeah, Paul could be lying. Maybe Paul is playing hooky, right, from work. Boss, oh, I got a toothache. I got to go to the dentist. Oh, okay. Sounds like Paul is weeping and making winces and groans. Okay, take the day off, Paul, and go see the dentist. And then, of course, Paul is like, ha ha, I've successfully gotten out of work for the day. So, yeah, he could be lying. He could be. But for some reason, they're not concerned about that. Sure, Paul could be acting it out. I mean, yeah, maybe even A isn't translatable. I mean, there are actors, right? My goodness. Excuse me, guys. Holly says, I'm putting together a research proposal and the dependent variable is attention. But I have to operationalize attention because I can only measure the physical result of attention or non-attention. I have to use a go, no-go task to get objective data. While I'm measuring something internal and mental, I can never grasp it without looking only at the behavior and maybe asking them how they feel. Well, that's certainly, yeah, you're right. But the behaviorist psychologists are going even further. And the logical behaviorists, like people like Hempel, are just saying the behavior is constitutive of the mental. So, yeah, I mean, Paul could be lying. Paul could be acting. But yeah, behaviorism, yeah. Yeah, Holly, like this is kind of like I think the middle ground. You have to operationalize what you're trying to measure, especially if it's something subjective like attention. You've got to operationalize it somehow. Um, but the behaviorist psychologists would say, like, we don't care about the inner states. Um, we care about the behavior, and the logical behaviorists would say the behavior just is the mental. Why is the site of the damaged tooth not translated? Well, we don't really need to translate it. It's already a physical description, right? Okay, we've got to stop and talk about mentalistic terminology like belief. So, what is belief? Well, belief, as well as desire, intention, etc., these are propositional attitudes, right? These are attitudes that one can take toward a proposition, which is a statement about the world that can be true or false. And the propositional attitudes feature this embedded that clause. So when we describe a propositional attitude in a sentence, using a sentence, we might say like, Josh believes that it is sunny outside. Or Josh believes that it is raining outside. Josh desires not to get rained on, and he believes there is an umbrella by the door. And he intends to take the umbrella with him when he leaves, right? We covered this a bit in chapter one, but just, in terms of recap, that's a propositional attitude. It's an attitude, could be belief, desire. These are attitudes, right? That we take towards propositions. These are statements about the world that could be true or false. And a propositional attitude, when it's given in a sentence itself, always has this that clause. So Paul has certain mental states. He's experiencing pain and believes that he has a toothache. But how can we define mental states like belief in terms of behavior? Here's the sentence Kim uses. S, which is just short for subject, S believes that there are no native leopards in North America. So S has a belief. S believes that there are no native leopards in North America. How could we define that sentence in terms of behavior or um, physical events or states? How would somebody who believes that there are no native leopards in North America even behave? What do you think? Yeah, they might not look for them. They might, however they behave, it might just not might not include leopard seeking behavior. Then again, they might go see a leopard at the zoo. Yeah, Leo, maybe when you ask them, do you believe leopards are native to North America? They would reply no. Yeah, Joshua, you're right. They could be lying. They might say yes or no, but believe something else. Yeah, maybe if they're frightened of leopards. They wouldn't be afraid while in North America. Bad news if a leopard escapes from the zoo and goes to your house, though. But isn't it possible that there really isn't any list of behaviors or potential sentences that describe S's beliefs in terms of behaviors instead of beliefs? It seems like a tricky thing to try and do, doesn't it? I mean, even Hayden, the way you've done this here, if they have a phobia of leopards, they would not be afraid. While in North America, afraid is a mentalistic term. So here's the thing, right? When we talk about pain, yeah, maybe we could do it that way, but they might just. I mean, it's possible that they are not afraid. I mean, they could be not afraid that there are leopards while still believing that maybe there are native leopards, even though that would be wrong. I guess it depends on whether they have a phobia of leopards, but um, the point is to illustrate that while pain as an inner state, an inner subjective state, is associated with pain behavior, they don't the same doesn't seem to be the case when it comes to other mental states like belief, right? So go back to A. Like, what does A say? So if Paul is in pain, Paul will weep and make gestures of such and such kinds. Like, yeah, that's what we do when we're in pain. We make noises. We go, we might say things like "ow." We might, I don't know, clutch the part that hurts, right? And there are going to be other physiological changes. Um, it doesn't seem to be the case with beliefs. We resort instead to verbal behavior. So a person who believes that there are, to continue with the leopard example, who believes that there are no native leopards in North America has a certain linguistic disposition. Kind of like, I believe it was Leo who said, if you asked, they would reply, there are no native leopards in North America, right? So we ask them, and they have a disposition to answer that there are no native leopards. We can sketch this out more schematically. We can say S believes that P is defined. This little subscript thing is definiens. That means that when we say S believes that P, that S has a disposition to answer, it is true that P. If you ask S, is it true that P? Excuse me, I need to get a glass of water. I'll be right back. Okay. So, yes, this is to say that if S believes that P, that is to say that S has a disposition to produce a certain sort of verbal behavior under certain specified conditions. So, for example, if you ask S, is it true that P? S will answer, yes, it is true that P. That's what this definiens means. It specifies that this means that S has a disposition to behave in certain ways in certain conditions. One interesting thing to note here is that to have these sorts of beliefs and desires, you have to be a skilled language user. These don't seem to be the kinds of beliefs that non-human animals have. Non-human animals surely have beliefs and desires, but they don't seem to be this sophisticated. Um, we also have to make an assumption here, and that is that S wants to tell the truth. So S has a belief, that that P is true, and S also has a desire to tell the truth when asked about P. So it seems like there's a complex of mental states that produce this verbal behavior, right? And that's how we get to the desire belief action principle, which says if a person desires that P and believes that doing A is an optimal way to secure P, she will do so now. Let's consider some examples. The case of Mary opening the windows is simple enough. We'll just do that one, right? Mary is working in her room, and it's quite warm. Now, Mary desires not to be so warm, and she believes that opening the window is an optimal way to not be so warm anymore. So she desires that P and believes that doing A is an optimal way to secure P. Or she desires P and doing A is an optimal way to secure P. She desires to not be so hot and believes opening the window is a way of securing not being so hot. So she'll open the window. Pretty straightforward, right? She's operating according to the belief, desire, action principle. But does this always have to go this way? Does this always have to work like this? No. Why wouldn't Mary open the window? Maybe it's really hot in Mary's apartment. Mary's trying to finish her philosophy paper. It's really, really hot. She's having trouble concentrating. She could open the window and let a breeze in to cool down. Why might she not do that? Yeah, yeah, Leo. Maybe there's an air quality advisory and Mary doesn't want to cough up a lung, right? That would be a third variable, as Holly says. Or maybe, like Kim says in the book, there's some road work going on, some construction, and there's like a jackhammer or something making a whole lot of noise. Mary could cool down and that would help her concentrate, but if she opens the window, the noise might make it even more difficult to concentrate. So she doesn't open the window, even though she believes that she could cool down by opening the window. This gets us to this defeasibility of mental behavioral entailments. If there is a plausible entailment of behavior B by mental states M1, or through any number of mental states, there is always a further mental state such that all of the mental states together plausibly entail not B. I know this sounds really complicated, but let's try and break it down. What is defeasibility? Anybody know what this word means? It's a word you hear quite a bit in like analytic philosophy of mind. What does it mean? It means basically that there are potential defeaters. It means that uh, you could, in principle, defeat or negate or do away with, right? So what this principle says is that there are mental behavioral entailments, mental states which entail behaviors, right? If you believe that it's hot and you desire not to be hot, and you believe that opening the window will allow you to not be hot, those mental states entail the behavior of opening the window. But these mental behavioral entailments are defeasible. They can always, in principle, be defeated by the addition of another mental state. In this case, Mary knows that opening the window will cool her apartment down, therefore cool her down. However, there's also a jackhammer out there making a lot of noise, and that's going to make it even more difficult to concentrate than the heat, right? So these mind to behavior connections are always defeasible by the occurrence of another mental state. Does that make sense to all of you? Mm-hmm. Good. Excellent. What does that mean for us? Well, there's lots of different examples we could go through, but this is kind of how Kim sums it up. Considerations like these make it seem exceedingly unlikely that anyone could ever produce correct behavioral definitions of mental terms linking every mental expression with an equivalent behavioral expression referring solely to the pure physical behavior, the motions and noises. To have even a glimmer of success, we would need, it seems, to work at the level of intentional action, not of physical behavior. That is, at the level of actions like greeting a friend, buying and selling, reading the morning paper, not behavioral at the level of motions and noises. So, yeah, questions? We're actually moving through this at a pretty good clip. Now, some mental phenomena, it should be pointed out, do seem tied to natural expressions in behavior, the motions and noises, right? Like pain. There are pain utterances that might vary a little bit from culture to culture, but usually when we're in pain, we cry out in some way. In English, we say ouch. Is there anybody who speaks a language other than English, or maybe you're from somewhere where your pain utterances are a little bit different? Just for example. Okay. How would you so okay. So Joshua says in Portuguese they say ai instead of ow. Salam in Ethiopian. Okay. Or not that. How do you pronounce that, Lee? My French is not very good. Would that be like I,
Yeah, it's just I.
I? Okay. Kind of sounds like the Portuguese. So, the word is different. Like the utterance is different, but one thing that we all have in common is that if we hurt ourselves, we make some kind of noise, right? Um, so there are those natural expressions, but there's more than that. Whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah. So, okay, I see. Yeah. So your daughter's still learning. So maybe she's associated hot with pain because I'm assuming maybe she burned herself. Um, but it really speaks to our point. Like, even though at some point she's going to learn that you can also say ouch, I bet she still says like hot, like like a pain utterance, a painy sort of behavior, right? Yeah, yeah, and that's the point. So those would be the natural expressions, but beyond that, Kim writes, let us first get clear about what entailment is to mean in a context of this kind. When we say that pain entails winces and groans, we are saying that anyone in pain winces and groans is analytically or conceptually true. That is, like, bachelors are unmarried and vixens are females. It is true solely in virtue of the meanings of the terms involved. That's what it means to be analytically true. So now we're talking about whether, we've already seen we've already seen we've talked about the defeasibility of mental behavioral entailments, right? So for complicated stuff like, Mary's opening the window. Now we're talking about whether pains entail these natural expressions of pain behavior. And entailment here is it means logical entailment. So when we're saying that pain entails winces and groans, we're saying the statement anyone in pain winces and groans is analytically or conceptually true. So anyone who makes some kind of natural expression, it could be a wince, a groan, ouch, I, hot, anything like that, it's necessarily true that they're in pain. In the same way that it's necessarily true that all bachelors are unmarried, right? Um, I just want to be clear. Are we clear on what these analytic statements are, or what it means to be analytically or conceptually true? I'll give you some examples. All triangles have three sides. Is that analytically true? Yes. Why? Why is it analytically true? Yeah. Yeah, you're both right. The definition of a triangle is a shape that has three sides. It's not because you can prove it. It's defined that way. Any two-dimensional polygon with three sides necessarily is a triangle, right? There are no four-sided triangles. There are plenty of four-sided polygons, but none of them are triangles, right? Yeah, like Joshua says, it's a statement that's always true just based on the nature and the definition of the words. Same with bachelors are unmarried, right? Ever meet a married bachelor? No, of course you haven't, because that's not what the word means. Vixens are females. Vixens, I believe, is the technical term for a female fox. So if you're like a zoologist and you go out and find a male fox and say, I found a male vixen. Well, no, you haven't. You found, I don't know what male foxes are called, actually. Someone should look that up. Or like Joey refers to a baby marsupial, right? That's just definitionally what it is, right? So to say that anyone in pain winces and groans is analytically true is to say that there's no possible world in which a being winces and groans and is not in pain. Now, does that work? Maybe not. Well, we're about to get to that, Lee. That's right where we're going next. Yeah, that's true. You could have someone that winces and groans but isn't in pain. Exactly. Or someone who is in pain but doesn't wince and groan, like a stoic. Yeah, this is exactly where we're going. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Maybe certain pain behaviors could have in a different possible world where there's different kinds of pain behavior. Well, that would seem to cast a little doubt on this here, right? So, what if there are super Spartans and super Stoics? The super Spartans and the super Stoics might never seem to they might never seem to exhibit pain. They could be in pain, but they wouldn't exhibit the pain behavior. But we could still say that these people have a disposition to behave in a painy sort of way, right? Yeah, Hayden, exactly. Like cats, right? Cats are mid-level predators, which means that they prey on small creatures, but cats can also be preyed upon by larger creatures. So for that reason, my vet actually, well, not my vet, my cat's vet, explained this to me. I asked her, "Is that really true?" And she said, "Yeah, because they're in this this role where they might not want to show any weakness because larger predators might prey on a weak or sick animal." And yeah, we do teach infants their pain reactions, like Holly says, right? Um, yeah, feral children might behave differently. Yeah, so these are children that are, kind of like abused in such a way where they have very limited contact with like fully developed adults, and they don't acquire language, and they don't behave the way a child raised by, typical parents behave, right? Um, yeah, good point. But let's limit to the super Spartans and the super Stoic. I guess if anyone is a super Spartan, it's Kratos here, um, who seems to exhibit pain, when he's out there, being a god of war. Um, but he also, hides a lot of pain, I think quite obviously. Not just physical pain, but emotional pain. If you've played the God of War games, you know what I'm talking about. But maybe somebody like Kratos or a super Spartan or a super Stoic like I don't know, Marcus Aurelius. I don't know if Marcus Aurelius was a super Stoic, but he was a Stoic. Maybe if you asked, "Are you in pain?" he might say, "Well, yes, but I can't show that because I'm trying to be a Stoic, right?" What about other kinds of creatures like this octopus? They are not going to wince and groan and say ouch because they don't have vocal cords. Um, the pain entailment thesis that we looked at, the one that says, anything that winces and groans is necessarily in pain, would deny that a creature like an octopus could experience pain because it lacks vocal cords. But that seems to be kind of absurd, right? I think, back in Descartes' day, 100%, a lot of people would have denied that non-human animals are capable of experiencing pain. Not everyone, but many would have. You know, um, Julien Offray de la Mettrie, the 18th century thinker, who I like to describe almost like the anti-Descartes, famously said that all animals are by their very nature cynics. So animals are really all about pain and pleasure. And for that reason, animals actually have a share of what he called the natural law, a sense of right and wrong, if you like. Because Lemaitre was kind of like an ethical hedonist, and he extended this to other members of the animal kingdom besides human beings. Descartes didn't. Um, sorry, which statement, Liam?
It was the quote that you were talking about, but it's necessary, not necessary and sufficient. So they don't have to scream to be in pain. That's not
Right.
what the statement said.
Well, the way that Kim has put it by saying it's analytically or conceptually true just means that anybody who's wincing and groaning is in pain, right?
Right, but you
I,
can be in pain. So, so this is equivalent to necessary and sufficient, the analytically equivalent.
yeah, yeah, but Kim is
Okay.
showing us that, right? Like he's saying, look, you could have super Stoics and super Spartans that don't behave, that don't exhibit this pain behavior. So it can't be. I guess what Kim is trying to say is like you're right, but Kim is trying to say it cannot be analytically or conceptually true. That or there cannot be a possible world where there's a being that winces and groans and isn't in pain. But I suppose, yeah, like these examples show that um, it's absurd to say that anybody who doesn't wince and groan could not be in pain. I guess a problem with interpreting this is that Kim is not actually putting a lot of this in, like he's doing a lot of this in natural language and not in actual like symbolic logic. So there's probably a bit of wiggle room in the way we understand these arguments, but we agree that it's absurd, right? To deny that a creature that doesn't wince and groan could be in pain. As I said, like back in Descartes' day, maybe it wouldn't have been absurd to deny animals experience pain. Um, Descartes actually likened animals to machines. He called them beast machines, right? To him, animals were automata. That is what we would call a robot today. So the takeaway, like Liam was saying, I think if I understood what you were saying, Liam, there's no specific behavior that's entailed by pain, right? So maybe we can formulate a weak behavior entailment thesis, which might say, for any pain-capable species, there is a certain behavior type B, such that for that species, being in pain entails a propensity to emit behavior of type B. But that means that there are many, many different possible kinds of pain behavior depending on what kind of species you are. Yeah, well, that might. Well, here's the thing, Holly, right? We could agree, like, okay, so humans have a propensity to go, ouch. Maybe octopus have a propensity to spray ink and try and hide. Um, Maybe dogs have a propensity to go, like, yelp, to make a yelping noise, right? Yeah, there's a species specific range of possible pain behaviors depending on what species you're talking about. They're going to exhibit different pain behavior. That's the satisfying part, right? But the unsatisfying part is that that would seem to make defining pain in terms of behavior impossible because it's going to vary from species to species, right? Like we can say pain for a human is winces and groans and going ouch, etc. Pain for a dog is crying out, like yelping. Pain for a cat might be a long, high-pitched meow or a hiss. Um, but pain overall, just pain in terms of behavior, it seems like our list of behaviors would be infinite or approach infinity, right? Because we're not talking about a species specific pain, but pain in general. Yeah. Okay, now on to ontological behaviorism. We've been looking at logical behaviorism, which deals with what we can say about mentality and about behavior and how the mental is constitutive, or rather, behavior is constitutive of the mental. Ontological behaviorism is a bit different. It's kind of metaphysical, right? It makes claims about what there is and what there isn't. What kinds of things are there? I mean, I've taught you that metaphysics is the study of reality. Ontology is the study of being or beings, and it's often treated as a sort of subfield of metaphysics. Um, so if you're like a radical behaviorist who is denying that there are inner states or that inner mental states don't play an important causal role, that's a kind of, that's like an ontological behaviorist claim because you're making a claim about those inner states, that they exist, that they do not exist, that they exist but play no important role, etc. If you were to deny that there are inner states or claim that they played no role, by the way, that you would be an eliminativist. That is, you are a subscriber to eliminativism. We've eliminated a lot of things in the sciences. So, for example, who knows what phlogiston is? Anybody heard of phlogiston? I should spell it in the chat. Well, I'm not surprised if you hadn't heard of it. It's something, it's a sort of thing that we used to appeal to explain fire. Yeah, maybe a Pokemon like I caught a phlogiston. I don't know. I don't know about Pokemon. I just know they catch them and then they can fight. But yeah, phlogiston was something we used to invoke to explain like how fire works. But now we understand that fire is combustion, and you need fuel and an oxidizer, and we don't need phlogiston to explain fire. What else? Elan Vital. Anyone know this one? I'll spell it out. Elan Vital. What's that? Well, it's a sort of yeah, like a life force. We appealed to it actually not that long ago, probably in the 18th, 19th centuries. Um, Elan Vital was a sort of life force or a principle, a vital principle that explained why things that are alive are alive. Um, Kind of analogous to the soul, I guess, maybe in the Aristotelian sense. But now we know a lot more about living things. We know about DNA, we know about metabolism and all that stuff. We don't need Elan Vital anymore to explain why things are alive. Or yeah, gravitons. We don't really believe in gravitons. We know about gravity as the curvature of space-time. So who needs gravitons, right? Although I'm not a physicist, so maybe there are some graviton stands out there. Yeah, the ether is another one, Yosef. That's exactly right. We used to have this idea of the luminiferous ether, which was like a medium through which light or gravity propagated. Um, Albert Einstein put an end to that by positing that space and time were really the same sort of thing. So once we had space time, we didn't need the luminiferous ether anymore. Um, the eliminativists say that mental states are like that. Beliefs and desires will one day be like the ether or elan vital or phlogiston. We won't need them anymore. We'll get rid of them because we can explain everything in terms of the physical, right? Well, maybe. Let's consider these two claims. Pain equals winces and groans. That's claim number one. And claim number two is pain is the cause of winces and groans. Well, claim number one is ontological behaviorism, and two is logical behaviorism. So, ontological behaviorism. Pain just is winces and groans. It's like the example of the churchlands that I think I gave in one of the previous lectures. Like, electricity doesn't cause lightning, electricity is lightning, right? Pain just is winces and groans. Oh, that's interesting, Liam. Responsible between field and matter, Higgs bosons. Yeah, that's why everybody called it the God particle, I guess. I remember that. Yeah, I remember that when that was a big deal, and Higgs got was it Higgs? Yeah, Higgs got the Nobel Prize for that for because he theorized the existence of this particle that they later found, right? And then he got the Nobel Prize, something like that. But yeah, pain just is winces and groans is ontological behaviorism. Pain is the cause of winces and groans is logical behaviorism. Does logical behaviorism entail ontological behaviorism? Kim says no. And does ontological behaviorism entail logical behaviorism? Seems to be no. We can go right to the book. Do we want to go to the book? Pages 79 to 80? Actually, I haven't opened up my copy of the book. Why don't we? See what it says here. I should have put this on my slide. Should have just quoted it. All right. What pages did we need to find again? Let me scroll down. '78, '79. Perfect. Here we are. So, claim one expresses an ontological behaviorism about pain. It tells us what pain is. It is winces and groans. But two is not a form of ontological behaviorism, since the cause of winces and groans need not be, and probably isn't, more behavior. Okay. Clearly, two must be affirmed by someone who thinks that it is an internal state of organisms. Yeah, so that's why one doesn't really entail the other. So if you believe, if you're an ontological behaviorist, you just identify pain as the winces and groans. But if you're a logical behaviorist, some inner state might be the cause of winces and groans. And sure, we can translate this back and forth without a loss of meaning. Ontological behaviorism is certainly the stronger of the two, but neither really seem to entail the other. So now where are we now that we're getting toward the end of the chapter? We're actually moving through this a lot quicker than I thought. I see that many people have left. Um, I kind of knew that would happen today. Yeah. Sorry. Bye, folks. I mean, good luck. Good luck to you. I hope you're able to get through it on YouTube. Um, where do we stand now? If a person observes someone writhing on the floor, clutching his broken leg, and screaming for help, and yet refuses to acknowledge that he is in pain, wouldn't it be correct to say that this person does not have the concept of pain, that he does not know what pain means? If Wittgenstein's beetle in the box shows anything, it is the point that publicly accessible behaviors are essential to anchor the meanings of our mental terms, like pain, and explain the possibility of knowledge of what goes on in other people's minds. I think what Wittgenstein would say is that if I understand your pain behavior or your painy language, it's because I'm playing the same language game as you are, right? The meaning, Wittgenstein, this is the way Wittgenstein puts it, but he says the meaning of a word is its use in the language game. But we could extend that to not just the word pain, but pain behavior. I know what the word pain means because I see it being used to refer to people who are behaving in a certain way. And that behavior is publicly accessible. Somebody on the floor writhing, clutching a leg and going, "Help, help, I'm in pain." Right? Well, okay. I can't see what beetle you have in your box, but it seems like the publicly accessible meanings that are anchored by how we use those words allow me to understand what's going on in your box, what's going on in your theater, right? And this is how Wittgenstein kind of saves himself from solipsism, right? Uh, More Kripke. Did I even talk about Kripke? I guess I talked about Kripke last time when I was talking about necessary identity statements. Sorry. Why did I put sorry? I guess because Kripke can be a bit tricky and also kind of a weird dude. Um, I don't know. I now I kind of have mixed feelings about talking about well, the behavior of certain philosophers, right? On the one hand, I think it's important to know when philosophers have behaved problematically, or that they have behaved problematically. But also, I've got to stress that this should not be taken as an ad hominem attack, right? And Kripke's really interesting. Kripke was a child prodigy, right? Kripke wrote a really interesting paper. I think it was his modal logic or something, the logic of possibility, all the possible world stuff we're talking about. Um, and he got an invitation. I think it was Harvard or Princeton. I can't remember who. One of the Ivy Leagues. Anyway, dear Professor Chris Kripke, we'd love you to come and teach a graduate course on logic at our fine institution. Kripke writes back, "That's very nice of you, but my mom says I should finish high school first, you know." So, bit of a prodigy. Kripke would go on to be a very renowned professor. He didn't have any advanced degrees in philosophy. He only had a bachelor's degree. Um, but his behavior was also very strange. You know, climbing up ladders and peeping on girls in the dormitory, kind of strange, right? Again, that's not an ad hominem. It's just I think it's important to know that philosophers are humans and are capable of terrible sorts of behaviors in addition to good sorts of behaviors, right? But that's not meant to be an ad hominem attack. So just to be clear on that. Anyway, this is an example from Kripke. I think actually from Kripke's interpretation of Wittgenstein, which is called Kripkenstein. Oh, we've lost more people now that I've been talking about Kripke. Sorry. Let's consider this. How long is 1 meter? Well, the standard meter is the meter we use to define the meter. And it's made of metal, and it's kept in a special vault somewhere in Paris, and it's 1 meter long. So we could say the standard meter is 1 meter long. Is that necessarily true? The standard meter is 1 meter long. Is it necessarily true that the standard meter, the meter we use to define what a meter is 1 meter long? No. We could have chosen something else to be the standard meter. And that something else might not have been 1 meter as we define it right now. So it's not necessarily true that the standard meter is 1 meter long. It's actually contingently true. The relationship between the standard meter, the object in Paris, and our concept of 1 meter is contingent, which means it could have been otherwise, right? It's kind of like if I decided to define the color red by pointing to a red tomato. Sure, it's red now, but a few days ago it might have been green. Or maybe it could have been one of those weird farmers market heirloom tomatoes that's purple or something, right? It's just contingent. If I define red by pointing at that particular tomato and I say that's red and that's how I'm going to define red, then my definition of red is just contingent upon what color the tomato was when I defined it that way, right? So can we use contingent facts to fix our concepts, say our concepts of pain with pain behavior? Well, Kim says, in worlds in which different laws hold, or worlds in which the central nervous systems of humans and those of other organisms are hooked up differently to peripheral sensory surfaces and motor output systems, the patterns of causal relations involving pain may be very different. But as things stand in this world, pain is the cause of winces and groans, and of certain other behaviors in humans and related animal species. So there's no logical entailment between pain and winces and groans. And that's what the logical behaviorists wanted, you'll recall. It's a contingent fact that in the world that we exist in, pain causes me to make winces and groans. But my nervous system could be different. I could be in another possible world where the nervous system is different, and instead of wincing and groaning, I make some kind of weird noise like blorb whenever I'm in pain. So I stub my toe, I don't go ouch, I go blorb, and somebody goes, "Oh, Josh just stubbed his toe. Sounds like it hurts pretty bad, right?" Um, and you can see how this applies to other animals, right? It's a contingent fact that my nervous system evolved the way it is. Likewise with octopus. And they have different pain behaviors than people. But there could be a possible world where all these creatures have different pain behaviors than they do in this world. Okay. I know I've thrown a lot at you today. Before we finish by circling back to behaviorism psychology, in psychology, does anyone have any questions? Sorry, but you get the point, right? Like, um, yeah, I want to stop. Like, well, oh, geez, we only have 10 minutes. Uh, I was trying to come up with a strange noise that we would know, we would never associate with pain. Um, yeah. I mean, maybe a better example would be like, okay, maybe there's a universe when we're in pain, we don't go ouch and wince and groan, but we laugh, right? Maybe that would be a better example. And in that world, also, when we hear something funny, we don't laugh, we go ouch, right? So it's just contingent. These behaviors are contingent. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Liam. So yeah, it is a lot to keep it to take in. My brain blorbs from all this. I get it. I see what you did there, Lee. Holly says, when I read the book and made notes, I thought it was clear, but after some discussion, I feel confused. Yeah, it'll all consolidate later. Yeah. Yeah, you see what I mean? Like, Holly, I think your comment is really good at illustrating the difference between something like philosophy of mind and psychology, right? And psychology, as you know, you're trying to answer empirical questions. Um, Whereas in philosophy, we're asking like really fundamental conceptual questions. And it does mean a change in thinking, because like, does pain, logically entail pain behavior? Well, that's just not the kind of question you can answer by running an experiment, right? It's a different sort of thing, right? So, I guess I take for granted that I have the benefit of being a cognitive scientist where I don't know as much philosophy as some people, and I don't know as much psychology as some people, but I know more psychology than most philosophers and more philosophy than most psychologists, if that makes sense, right? So I have the benefit of this, being a sort of jack of all trades. Um, but when you're first trying to get used to this, it's different, right? Yeah, like, well, how could we test the leopard people? But yeah. Oh, neat. Oh, so you took a workshop with the pain lab doctor at Queens. But that pain lab doctor, he's got to operationalize those inner states somehow. I don't think he's a full-on behaviorist, right? He's not going to deny that there's something that it's like to be in pain, but whatever you're measuring has to be public, objective, observable, etc., right? And it is really, I think, about finding the middle ground. We started to get back to this, like I said, in the cognitive revolution. And then, of course, there was the mental imagery debate, which was really interesting. Shepard, Metzler, and those guys were asking people to like mentally rotate shapes to see if they were the same. Like they'd be like, here's two shapes from a different perspective. Are they the same? And the subjects would have to like imagine the shape and rotate them to try and match them up to tell whether they're the same or different. And it was really interesting because they're relying on subjective mental imagery, but they were actually able to objectively measure the time it took for people to answer whether they were the same or the different shapes. And what they found that there was a linear relationship between the time it took to answer and the degree of rotation. So the longer they had to rotate that shape, or the more they had to rotate it, the longer it took to answer whether they're the same shape or not. And that's really interesting. That was one of those key moments in the cognitive revolution. where we it's like we didn't know what it was like to be in the other person's theater. We didn't see their Beatles in their boxes. But the more they had to rotate to compare, the longer it took. And it was like a nearly perfect linear relationship between degree of rotation and response time. It was the same with mental maps too. Like people would have to look at a map and then imagine the map, like how would you get from here to here? Um, and yeah, really cool stuff. Really cool stuff. Just go read about the mental imagery debate. It's very cool. Maybe we ought to just leave it here for today, and we'll just talk about behaviorism in psychology next time before we get into mind-brain identity theory. How does that sound to all of you? Because I'll be honest, my voice is starting to go with the smoke and everything. So, okay. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Hayden, what's your question? You and me both, Hayden. Um, I guess they're just saying that those whatever they're not a separate kind of state. Like they're not denying that nobody's in pain, right? They're saying that pain just is the physical state. So they're not property dualists where they're like, okay, there's these brain states and these mental states supervene on those brain states. Rather, those mental states just are those physical states, right? So it's not to say we don't have inner experiences, it's that those things are just identifiable they're identical to the brain states. We'll see this when we talk about identity theory next time. Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, Liam. Yeah, I don't think I'm sick. I think it's just the wildfire smoke. All those poor people, yeah, Manitoba and Ontario are under an air quality advisory, and these poor people way out north have to get flown out of their communities because of all the fires. Um, I think let's keep thinking about those folks. Okay, let's. I hope they're all okay. I don't know any of them, but I hope they're okay. Um, okay. Well, I'll see you on Wednesday. We'll just finish off this last section, this last 5 slides or so, and then we'll talk about identity theory. Um, of the supplementary readings, if you're going to read the supplementary readings, just read Smarts. Don't read Feigel's. It's ridiculously long. Save it for later. Save it for like if you want to write your essay on mind brain identity theory. It's like 60 pages. The Smart paper is a lot shorter, but I do recommend you read JCC Smart's paper. Yeah, yeah, good timing. Yeah, I hope it's less smoky over there across the pond. Okay, well, thanks everybody. I'll see you all on Wednesday. Oh, good. I'm glad it's nice. Okay, bye for now, everyone.